The shuttle's engines screamed as it cut through Earth's atmosphere, carrying Lieutenant Sarah Chen back to a world that felt smaller than the vast battlefields of the Kepler front. Through the viewport, she watched the familiar blue marble grow larger, its surface unmarked by the scorch marks and crater fields that had become her daily reality for the past 3 years. Her reflection stared back at her from the reinforced glass. 21 years old, but with eyes that had seen too much. The scar running from her left temple to her jaw told only part of her story. The real changes ran deeper, invisible to casual observers, but as real as the titanium plates holding her ribs together. Sarah had been 18 when the Zephyrian Empire declared war on the Human Colonial Alliance. Fresh out of high school, she had enlisted the same day the news broke about the massacre at New Geneva Colony. While her classmates headed to college campuses across Earth, she shipped out to basic training on Mars Station 7. The war was supposed to last 6 months. It had dragged on for 3 brutal years. The shuttle touched down at Edwards Spaceport with barely a whisper. Sarah gathered her duffel bag. Everything she owned in the universe fit into that single olive-green container. Her dress blues hung perfectly pressed, adorned with ribbons that represented battles most Earth-dwellers had only heard about in sanitized news reports. The silver star on her chest felt heavier than its actual weight. "Welcome home, Lieutenant," the shuttle pilot said, as she prepared to disembark. He was young, probably never left the Sol system. His uniform was clean, unstained by alien blood or the red dust of Proxima b. Sarah nodded her thanks and stepped onto the boarding ramp. Earth's gravity felt strange after so long in various artificial environments. The air smelled wrong too clean, lacking the metallic tang of recycled atmosphere and the ever-present scent of ozone from energy weapons. Her mother waited beyond the security checkpoint, tears streaming down her face. Margaret Chen looked older, grayer, as if the worry of having a daughter in combat had aged her faster than time itself. Behind her stood Sarah's father, Dr. David Chen, whose academic posture hadn't changed, despite 3 years of watching war reports. "My baby," her mother whispered, crushing Sarah in an embrace that triggered muscle memory from too many close-quarters combat situations. For a split second, Sarah's hand moved toward where her plasma rifle would normally hang before she caught herself. "I'm okay, Mom," she said, though the words felt hollow. She wasn't okay. None of the soldiers who came back were okay, not really. But civilians needed to hear those words to sleep at night. The ride home to suburban Sacramento passed in uncomfortable silence. Her parents chatted about neighborhood gossip, changes in the local shopping center, anything to avoid discussing where their daughter had been and what she had done. Through the car windows, Sarah watched normal people living normal lives, walking dogs, mowing lawns, arguing about parking spaces. It all seemed impossibly fragile. Their house looked exactly the same. White picket fence, carefully maintained garden, solar panels glinting on the roof. Her childhood bedroom had been preserved like a shrine, posters of ancient Earth musicians still decorating the walls alongside certificates from her high school science fairs. It felt like looking at someone else's life. At dinner, her father finally broached the subject everyone was dancing around. "So what's your plan now? The GI Bill will cover your education expenses. Stanford still has your deferred acceptance letter." Sarah pushed food around her plate. Military rations had taught her to eat efficiently, not to savor. "I'm not sure college is what I need right now." "But you always wanted to study xenobiology," her mother added hopefully. "Remember how excited you got about the possibility of alien life?" The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. She had learned more about alien biology than any textbook could teach, specifically, how to stop alien biology from functioning. She knew exactly where to place a plasma bolt to drop a Zephyrian warrior in its tracks, how their 3-chambered hearts responded to human stimulants. and which of their major arteries bled out fastest. Not exactly the curriculum her parents had in mind. "Things change," Sarah said quietly. That night, she lay in her childhood bed, staring at glow-in-the-dark stars she had stuck to the ceiling when she was 12. They reminded her of the real stars she had seen from the trenches of Kepler 442b, how they had provided the only light during the 67-day siege of Firebase Echo. She had watched those same stars as friends died around her, as she called in artillery strikes that vaporized entire enemy positions. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams that weren't really dreams, but memories. The screech of Zephyrian battle cries, the smell of burning atmosphere as ships died in the void, the weight of Private Martinez's body as she carried him to the evacuation zone, knowing he wouldn't make it but trying anyway. She woke at 0400, muscle memory from 3 years of military routine. The house was silent, peaceful in a way that made her skin crawl. Peace meant vulnerability. Quiet meant the enemy might be moving into position. She dressed in workout clothes and went for a run through her old neighborhood, letting the familiar streets ground her in reality. Mrs. Henderson was out walking her ancient golden retriever. She waved enthusiastically, the same way she had when Sarah was a kid delivering newspapers. "Sarah, you're back. We're so proud of you, dear. Such a hero." Hero. The word sat wrong in Sarah's stomach. Heroes were characters in stories, people who saved the day and rode into the sunset. She wasn't a hero. She was a soldier who had done what needed doing and survived when others didn't. There was a difference civilians would never understand. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson," she replied, maintaining the polite facade her parents had raised her with. The conversation was mercifully brief. Mrs. Henderson's understanding of the war came from sanitized news reports and propaganda videos. She spoke about it like a sports match, where humans had won and everyone could go back to normal now. She had no frame of reference for what it meant to hold a dying 18-year-old who cried for his mother in 3 different languages because the translation implants had malfunctioned. Sarah's old high school lay along her running route. Lincoln High looked smaller than she remembered, its brick facades and perfectly manicured lawns a stark contrast to the improvised structures and blast barriers that had become normal architecture in her world. Students were arriving for early morning activities, their biggest concerns apparently involving college applications and social drama. She paused at the edge of the school property, watching teenagers who looked impossibly young despite being only a few years her junior. They moved with the careless confidence of people who had never worried about snipers or improvised explosive devices. Their laughter carried on the morning air, untainted by the knowledge of what humans were capable of when pushed to extremes. A banner stretched across the main entrance. "Welcome back hero Sarah Chen, class of 2157. Her old principal, Dr. Williams, had apparently organized some kind of homecoming ceremony. Sarah's stomach tightened. She wasn't ready for that kind of attention, wasn't ready to stand in front of people who would expect her to represent something noble and inspiring. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Dr. Williams called. They want to do an assembly Thursday. So exciting." Sarah stared at the message, then at the school where she had spent 4 years worried about tests and crushes and college admission. Those problems seemed laughably trivial now, but they had been real to the person she used to be. That Sarah Chen had died somewhere between the first battle and the last, replaced by someone harder and more efficient, but infinitely more fragile. She turned away from the school and continued her run, pushing her pace until her legs burned and her lungs strained. Physical pain was simple, honest. It had clear causes and predictable solutions, unlike the complex web of guilt, anger, and disconnection that made up her current existence. Back home, her parents were preparing for their respective jobs, Her mother to the local elementary school where she taught third grade, her father to UC Davis where he researched sustainable agriculture. Normal jobs for normal people in a normal world that had somehow continued functioning while she fought for its right to exist. "How was your run, sweetheart?" her mother asked, making coffee with the same cheerful efficiency Sarah remembered from childhood. "Fine," Sarah replied, because saying anything else would require explanations she couldn't give. How could she explain that running helped drown out the voices of dead friends? That the rhythm of her footsteps matched the cadence of artillery fire that still echoed in her head? Her father looked up from his tablet where he was reviewing research proposals. "I was thinking we could visit campus today. Show you what's changed. Maybe sit in on a lecture or two. Professor Martinez always asks about you." Professor Martinez. Sarah remembered him vaguely, an enthusiastic xenobiology instructor who had fueled her teenage dreams of discovering new forms of life. He probably still believed in the romantic notion of peaceful first contact, of scientific exchange between species. The reality was far messier. First contact usually involved weapons fire, and scientific exchange meant analyzing enemy capabilities to exploit their weaknesses. "Maybe later," she said, pouring her own coffee. "I'm still adjusting to being back." Her parents exchanged a look, the kind of worried parent communication that transcended words. They meant well, but they were trying to fit the person she had become back into the space left by the person she used to be. It was like trying to force a sword back into its mold after it had been forged. The morning news played on the kitchen television, showing footage from the peace treaty signing ceremony. President Martinez shook hands with the Zephyrian High Command, while diplomats from both species smiled for the cameras. The war was over, officially. But Sarah knew the difference between military victory and lasting peace. The Zephyrians had sued for terms not because they embraced humanity's vision, but because continued fighting would have destroyed both civilizations. That wasn't peace. It was an intermission. "Such wonderful news," her mother commented, watching the diplomatic pageantry. "Finally, we can all move forward." Move forward. Another phrase that sounded simple but contained multitudes of complexity. Moving forward implied leaving the past behind, but Sarah's past was written in scar tissue and muscle memory. It was embedded in the way she automatically mapped exit routes in every room, how she woke at the slightest sound, how her hand still reached for weapons that weren't there. The phone rang, interrupting her brooding. Her mother answered with characteristic cheerfulness. "Oh, hello, Dr. Williams. Yes, she's right here. Just a moment." She covered the phone and whispered to Sarah, "It's your principal. He wants to talk about the assembly." Sarah took the phone reluctantly. Dr. Williams's voice was exactly as she remembered, warm, enthusiastic, and completely disconnected from reality. "Sarah, we're so proud of you. A real war hero right here in our community. The students are so excited to hear from you. We've planned a special assembly for Thursday morning. You can tell them all about your adventures and inspire the next generation." Adventures. As if war was summer camp with better stories. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of expectations she couldn't meet. "Dr. Williams, I appreciate the sentiment, but I'm not sure I'm ready for something like that." "Nonsense! You're being modest. The whole community wants to celebrate you. We've invited local news, some parents, even a few district officials. It'll be wonderful." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Dr. Williams steamrolling over her hesitation with relentless positivity. By the time she hung up, Sarah felt trapped in a commitment she hadn't actually agreed to, but couldn't figure out how to escape. Her father looked up from his tablet. "Everything okay?" "They want me to speak at a school assembly. Tell the kids about the war." "That's wonderful. You'll be great." But Sarah wasn't wonderful, and she wouldn't be great. She was a combat veteran with 3 years of killing experience, and a head full of memories that would give those kids nightmares. What was she supposed to tell them? How do you explain to teenagers that their video games got the sounds wrong, that real plasma rifles made a different whine when they fired, that enemy soldiers died just as messily as human ones? The rest of the day passed in a blur of well-meaning relatives and neighbors stopping by to welcome her home. Each conversation followed the same pattern: expressions of pride, questions about her service that they didn't really want answered, and assumptions about her readiness to return to normal life. By evening, Sarah felt like she was wearing a costume of her former self, performing for an audience that would never understand the real story. That night, she sat on her childhood bed, uniform spread out before her. The ribbons told a story in military shorthand: the Bronze Star for valor during the defense of Kepler Station, the Purple Heart for injuries sustained in the Battle of Titan's Reach, the Combat Infantry Badge that marked her as someone who had seen ground combat. Each decoration represented specific moments of violence and survival, crystallized into colorful fabric and metal. Tomorrow, she would have to decide what story to tell those kids at the assembly. The sanitized version where war was noble and soldiers were heroes. The honest version where war was chaos and soldiers were people doing terrible things for necessary reasons. Or some middle ground that would satisfy everyone while helping no one. She fingered the silver star, remembering the action that had earned it. Firebase Echo had been under siege for 2 months when the Zephyrian assault finally breached the outer perimeter. Sarah's platoon had been cut off from the main force, trapped in a communications bunker with dwindling ammunition and no hope of reinforcement. The citation read that she had displayed conspicuous gallantry under fire when she led a counterattack that broke the enemy advance and allowed the evacuation of critically wounded personnel. What the citation didn't mention was the sound Private Kim made when the Zephyrian blade punched through his chest, or how long it took Sergeant Rodriguez to die after the plasma burst caught him in the abdomen. It didn't describe the weight of the decision to use the last of their medical supplies on soldiers who might survive while letting others die in relative comfort. It said nothing about the 17 Zephyrian soldiers she had killed in hand-to-hand combat, or how their blood had looked almost human as it pooled in the red dirt. Those were the details that mattered, the ones that explained why she couldn't sleep through the night and why sudden movements made her reach for weapons. But they weren't the kind of details you shared with high school students whose biggest trauma was failing a chemistry test. Sarah lay back on her bed, staring at those childhood stars again. In 3 days, she would stand in front of an auditorium full of kids and try to explain something she didn't fully understand herself. She would smile and answer questions and pretend that coming home was the happy ending everyone wanted to believe in. But deep down, she knew the truth. Sarah Chen had died on the battlefields of distant worlds. The person who came back was someone else entirely, someone harder, more dangerous, and infinitely less innocent. The school wanted to celebrate a hero, but heroes were myths. What they were getting was a warrior who didn't know how to be anything else. The assembly was in 3 days. 3 days to figure out how to bridge the gap between who she had been and who she was now, between the reality of war and the fantasy of glory. 3 days to decide whether to give them the lie they wanted or the truth they couldn't handle. Outside her window, the suburban night was peaceful and quiet. No artillery fire echoed in the distance. No emergency sirens wailed their warnings. It was the kind of peace she had fought to preserve, the normalcy that made all the violence worthwhile. But sitting in the middle of that peace, Sarah had never felt more alone or more lost. The war was over, but the battle for her own identity was just beginning. Thursday morning arrived too soon. Sarah stood in her childhood bathroom, adjusting her dress uniform for the 3rd time. The jacket fit differently now. Her shoulders were broader from carrying heavy equipment, her posture straighter from military bearing. The silver star caught the light, reminding her of the weight of other people's expectations. Her mother hovered in the doorway, tears threatening to spill over. "You look so handsome, sweetheart. So official." Official. That was one way to describe it. Sarah felt more like she was wearing armor, preparing for a different kind of battle. The school assembly had grown from a simple welcome home into something much larger. According to her father's morning briefing, local news crews would be present, along with several district officials and a representative from the mayor's office. "I made your favorite breakfast," her mother continued, wringing her hands. "Pancakes with strawberries." Sarah's stomach turned. Field rations had trained her system for efficiency, not comfort. Rich foods felt excessive now, wasteful in a way that reminded her of the hunger she'd seen on refugee ships. But she nodded anyway, because disappointing her mother felt worse than forcing down food she couldn't properly digest. The drive to Lincoln High took 15 minutes through familiar suburban streets. Sarah watched the morning routine of normal people, joggers maintaining their fitness for purely aesthetic reasons, parents rushing children to schools where the greatest danger was social embarrassment. It amazed her how quickly civilization had reasserted itself, how efficiently humans could forget the threat that had nearly destroyed everything they claimed to value. The school parking lot was fuller than she remembered from her student days. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes pointing skyward like mechanical flowers seeking sunlight. A small crowd of early arrivals clustered near the main entrance, many holding signs with variations of "Welcome Home Hero" and "Thank you for your service." Dr. Williams met them at the car, his enthusiasm undimmed by 3 years and the early morning hour. He looked exactly the same, gray beard neatly trimmed, cheap suit slightly wrinkled, eyes bright with the kind of idealism that survived only in environments insulated from real consequence. "Sarah, you look magnificent. Absolutely magnificent." He pumped her hand with both of his, oblivious to her slight flinch at the unexpected contact. "We have quite the program planned. Channel 7 wants a brief interview beforehand, and Councilwoman Rodriguez would like to present you with a key to the city." A key to the city. Sarah wondered what door it was supposed to open, what symbolic meaning it held for people who had never left their home planet. She had keys to ammunition lockers and military vehicles scattered across 3 star systems, but those were tools with actual purpose. The interview was a blur of predictable questions and carefully crafted responses. The reporter was young, maybe fresh out of journalism school, with the kind of eager sincerity that reminded Sarah of new recruits before their first real firefight. She asked about heroism and sacrifice and the honor of serving humanity, using words that transformed ugly necessity into noble purpose. "What was the most challenging part of your service?" the reporter asked, holding her microphone like a weapon pointed at truth. Sarah paused, considering honest answers. The most challenging part was learning to kill efficiently without losing yourself in the process. It was watching friends die for strategic objectives that changed the next week. It was the constant calculation of acceptable losses and the knowledge that you might be one of them. It was coming home to discover that the person you used to be had been a casualty of war, just like everyone else. "Staying connected to the values we were fighting to protect," she said instead, which was true enough to pass for honesty while remaining safe enough for morning television. The auditorium was packed beyond capacity. Students filled every seat with overflow crowds standing along the walls. Sarah recognized some faces from her own graduation class, kids who had chosen college over combat, who now looked impossibly young despite being her exact age. Their eyes held curiosity and something that might have been envy, as if military service was an adventure they had missed rather than a grinder of human souls. Dr. Williams introduced her with the kind of flowery language reserved for graduation speeches and memorial services. He spoke about duty and honor and the proud tradition of Lincoln High graduates serving their community and their species. Sarah half listened, focusing instead on reading the crowd and identifying potential threats. old habits that would probably never fade. The applause was thunderous as she approached the podium. Hundreds of faces looked up at her expectantly, waiting for inspiration or wisdom or at least an entertaining story. Sarah gripped the lectern, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard over weapons fire. 3 years ago, I was sitting in those same seats worried about the same things you're worried about. Tests, relationships, college applications. Whether I was smart enough or brave enough or good enough to make something of myself." The auditorium was perfectly quiet now, the kind of attention usually reserved for emergency announcements. Sarah could see her parents in the front row, her mother clutching her father's hand like Sarah was about to reveal some terrible family secret. "When the war started, I thought I understood what it meant to serve. I thought it was about being a hero, about doing something important that would make people proud. I thought war was like the movies, clear good guys and bad guys, dramatic music, decisive victories that solved problems permanently." She paused, scanning the sea of young faces. Many of them probably still believed those things, still thought violence could be clean and purpose could be simple. "I was wrong about almost everything." A murmur rippled through the crowd. This wasn't the inspiring speech they had expected, wasn't the comfortable narrative about noble sacrifice and glorious victory. War isn't about being a hero. Heroes are fictional characters who always know the right thing to do and always have the strength to do it. Real soldiers are just people making impossible choices with incomplete information under circumstances designed to break them. Dr. Williams shifted uncomfortably in his front row seat. The news cameras continued rolling, but Sarah could sense the operators behind them growing uncertain about what story they were capturing. "I want to tell you about Private Martinez," she continued, abandoning the safe speech she had planned. "He was 19, from Phoenix, and he wanted to be a teacher when he got home. He carried pictures of his little sister in his helmet and wrote letters home every day, even when there was no way to send them." The auditorium remained silent, but it was a different kind of silence now, tense, waiting for something that might change everything. "Private Martinez died on Kepler 442b during our last major offensive. He stepped on an improvised explosive device while running supplies to our forward position. The blast took both his legs and most of his pelvis. It took him 43 minutes to die, and he was conscious for most of it." Several students were crying now, and Sarah could see teachers along the walls making subtle gestures toward the principal. This wasn't the kind of story schools told. Wasn't the sanitized version of service they used to encourage civic participation. "I held his hand while he died," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying easily through the hushed auditorium. "He asked me to tell his sister that he was sorry he wouldn't make it to her quinceañera. He was worried about disappointing her." Dr. Williams started to stand, probably intending to cut the presentation short, but something in Sarah's posture kept him frozen in place. She wasn't finished, and everyone in the room could sense it. "That's what war actually is," she continued. "It's not glory or honor or noble sacrifice. It's good people dying for necessary reasons while other good people make the hardest decisions imaginable. It's coming home to discover that the person you used to be was another casualty, and learning to live as someone you don't entirely recognize." The silence stretched, heavy with uncomfortable truth. Sarah could see the exact moment when her audience realized this wasn't going to be the feel-good story they had gathered to hear. "But here's what I want you to understand," she said, softening her voice without reducing its intensity. "Martinez knew the risks. We all did. And we chose to take them anyway, not because we were heroes, but because some things are worth protecting even when the cost is everything." She gestured toward the crowd of students, their faces a mixture of confusion, fear, and dawning understanding. "You are worth protecting. This place, These choices you get to make about tests and relationships and your futures, this normal, boring, safe life you probably take for granted, it's worth dying for. Not because it's perfect, but because it's yours. The applause started slowly, uncertainly, but built into something deeper than the automatic response that had greeted her arrival. This wasn't polite appreciation for a visiting speaker. This was recognition of something true and terrible and important. Sarah stepped back from the podium, feeling simultaneously drained and relieved. She had told them something real, something that mattered. Whether they understood it now or would only grasp its meaning years later, she had given them truth instead of comfortable lies. Dr. Williams rose quickly, moving to the microphone with the kind of practiced efficiency educators use to manage unexpected situations. Let's give Lieutenant Chen another round of applause for her honest perspective on her service. But the damage was done. Or perhaps the healing had begun. Students were talking to each other in whispers, processing what they had heard. Some looked disturbed, others thoughtful. A few seemed angry, as if Sarah had stolen something from them by refusing to be the simple hero they had expected. The aftermath was awkward and inevitable. Local officials who had come expecting a photo opportunity found themselves dealing with a story that wouldn't fit neatly into campaign literature. The news crews packed up their equipment with the subdued efficiency of people who knew their footage would never make it to air in its current form. That was quite a speech, Councilwoman Rodriguez said, as Sarah made her way through the crowded lobby. Very authentic. Authentic. Another word that sounded positive but carried undertones of disapproval. Sarah had been authentic. And authenticity was uncomfortable for people who preferred their reality filtered through more palatable narratives. Students approached her in small groups throughout the morning, their questions more serious and probing than the softball inquiries she had expected. One sophomore girl asked what it felt like to kill someone. A junior boy wanted to know if she ever regretted enlisting. A senior, clearly thinking about her own post-graduation plans, asked whether civilian life would ever feel normal again. Sarah answered as honestly as she could without completely destroying their faith in human institutions. She talked about the weight of taking life, even enemy life, and how it changed your relationship with violence forever. She explained that regret was too simple a word for the complex mixture of pride, guilt, necessity, and loss that defined military service. She admitted that normal was a moving target, that the person she had been before the war was gone permanently, but that didn't mean the person she was now couldn't find meaning and purpose. By lunchtime, word of the assembly had spread throughout the school. Sarah found herself surrounded by students who hadn't been in the auditorium but had heard fragments of her speech through the efficient communication network that connected all educational institutions. The stories grew in the telling, becoming darker and more dramatic than what she had actually shared. "Is it true you killed like 100 aliens?" one freshman asked, with the kind of morbid fascination teenagers brought to all forms of violence. "Numbers don't matter," Sarah replied. "Every life taken has weight, whether it's 1 or 100. The question isn't how many, but whether the reasons were sufficient." The kid looked disappointed, probably expecting either proud boasting or traumatic confession. Sarah's measured response didn't fit the narrative framework he had been prepared to receive. Mrs. Patterson, her old English teacher, approached during the lunch break with the careful manner of someone navigating potentially dangerous territory. "That was quite a presentation this morning. The students are certainly talking about it." "I imagine they are," Sarah said. "Not what anyone expected." "No, it wasn't. But maybe that's what they needed to hear." Mrs. Patterson looked thoughtful, weighing her words carefully. "We spend so much time trying to protect them from difficult truths that we sometimes forget they're stronger than we think." It was the first genuinely supportive comment Sarah had received all day. The administrators were clearly unhappy with her deviation from script, and many parents were already calling to express concern about the appropriateness of her remarks. But Mrs. Patterson, who had spent decades helping teenagers navigate the transition to adulthood, understood the value of honest conversation about difficult subjects. "They asked me to inspire them," Sarah said. "I tried to give them something more useful than inspiration." "What's that?" "Perspective. Understanding. The knowledge that their choices matter because other people have paid the price to preserve their right to make them." The afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors to the guidance counselor's office, where Sarah had been stationed to meet with individual students who requested private conversations. Most wanted to discuss military service as a career option, but their questions revealed a more sophisticated understanding of what that choice entailed than she had expected. Jennifer Walsh, a senior with college plans already in motion, asked about the psychological costs of combat service. "My brother wants to enlist, but he's never been in a real fight. He plays video games and thinks he understands violence, but after what you said this morning..." Sarah spent 20 minutes explaining the difference between simulated conflict and actual combat, how training could prepare your body and mind for the mechanics of warfare, but couldn't fully simulate the emotional and psychological impact of life-and-death decisions. She talked about the support systems the military provided and the resources available for processing trauma, but she was honest about the fact that some changes were permanent. Marcus Johnson, a junior from a military family, wanted to know about the moral dimensions of following orders in combat situations. His father had served in the previous colonial conflicts, but they had been smaller engagements against human separatist groups. The Zephyrian War had been humanity's first true interspecies conflict, with all the additional complexity that entailed. "How do you know you're fighting for the right side when the enemy isn't even human?" he asked. "How do you make moral judgments about alien minds you don't understand?" It was a sophisticated question that got to the heart of the ethical challenges Sarah had faced throughout her service. She explained how the military's rules of engagement had been adapted for non-human opponents, how intelligence officers had worked to understand Zephyrian psychology and cultural values, and how individual soldiers had to balance strategic objectives with personal conscience. "In the end," she said, "you make the best decisions you can with the information available and you live with the consequences. The alternative is paralysis, which helps no one." By the time the final bell rang, Sarah felt more exhausted than she had after some combat operations. The emotional labor of honest conversation was different from physical danger, but no less draining. She had given these kids something real, something that would stick with them, as they made their own choices about service and sacrifice. Dr. Williams walked her to the parking lot, his earlier enthusiasm replaced by professional concern. "I've had several calls from parents about your presentation this morning. Some felt it was inappropriate for the age group." Sarah nodded, unsurprised. "They wanted a fairy tale. I gave them truth." "Yes. Well, perhaps in the future we might discuss content beforehand, make sure everyone's on the same page about expectations. There wouldn't be a future, at least not at Lincoln High." Sarah had burned that bridge by refusing to be the convenient symbol they had wanted. But that was acceptable. She had accomplished something more important than public relations. She had given a group of young people the gift of honest information about choices they might face. Her parents waited by the car, their expressions mixing pride with concern. The drive home was quiet, each family member processing the day's events according to their own perspective. Sarah stared out the window at the familiar suburban landscape, thinking about the students she had met and the questions they had asked. That evening, her phone buzzed with a text message from a number she didn't recognize. "Thank you for today. You gave me a lot to think about." Jennifer Walsh. More messages followed as the evening progressed, students sharing their thoughts, asking follow-up questions, or simply expressing gratitude for honest conversation about difficult subjects. Not all the responses were positive. Several people criticized her for destroying childhood innocence or undermining recruitment efforts. But the thoughtful messages outweighed the negative ones. Sarah sat on her bed that night, still wearing her dress uniform, reading through the responses her presentation had generated. She had set out to inspire, but inspiration was cheap and temporary. Instead, she had offered something more valuable: truth, complexity, and the respect that came with being treated as adults capable of handling difficult realities. The school might not invite her back, and the local officials might regret their photo opportunity, but the students would remember. They would carry her words with them as they made their own choices about service, sacrifice, and the price of protecting what they valued. For the first time since returning home, Sarah felt like she had accomplished something meaningful, not as a hero or a symbol, but as a human being sharing hard-won wisdom with the next generation. It wasn't the homecoming anyone had planned, but it was honest in a way that mattered more than comfort. 6 months after the assembly, Sarah stood in the parking lot of the Veterans Administration building, watching other former soldiers navigate the bureaucracy of returning to civilian life. Some walked with visible wounds, missing limbs, burn scars, the careful movements of people whose bodies had been rebuilt rather than healed. Others, like herself, carried invisible damage that was harder to explain but no less real. The counseling sessions had helped, though not in the way her parents had hoped. Dr. Elena Vasquez, herself a veteran of the earlier colonial conflicts, didn't try to fix Sarah or make her normal again. Instead, she helped Sarah understand that the person she had become wasn't broken, just different, changed by experiences that most humans would never face. "You can't go backward," Dr. Vasquez had explained during their first session. "The goal isn't to become who you used to be. The goal is to figure out who you are now and how to make that person's life meaningful." Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from Jennifer Walsh, now a college freshman studying international relations. The text included a photo of Jennifer at a Model UN conference, representing the Human Colonial Alliance in simulated negotiations with mock Zephyrian delegates. The accompanying message read, "Using everything you taught me about complex moral choices. Thank you for making me think harder about service and sacrifice." It had become a pattern. Students from that assembly continued to reach out, sharing updates on their lives and the ways her presentation had influenced their thinking. Marcus Johnson had enlisted in the Colonial Defense Force, but chosen the intelligence track rather than direct combat, inspired by their conversation about understanding alien psychology. 3 other students had changed their college majors to xenobiology or diplomatic studies. 2 had decided against military service entirely, but with a deeper appreciation for those who chose that path. The ripple effects of honesty, Sarah had learned, traveled farther than comfortable lies. Her own path had taken unexpected turns. The deferred acceptance to Stanford still waited, but xenobiology felt like studying theoretical physics when you had already built nuclear reactors. The academic approach to alien life seemed impossibly naive after 3 years of studying Zephyrian anatomy through combat necessity. Instead, Sarah had found her calling in an unexpected place: the Veterans Transition Program at Sacramento Community College. She taught courses for returning soldiers on adapting civilian skills for military experience, but more importantly, she helped them process the psychological transition from warrior to citizen. "The hardest part isn't learning new skills," she told her current class, a mix of recent veterans and soldiers preparing for discharge. "It's learning to value different things. In combat, efficiency matters more than politeness. Speed matters more than consensus. Survival matters more than comfort. Civilian life has different priorities, and that's not wrong, it's just different." Sergeant Rodriguez, a tank operator missing his left hand, raised his remaining one. "How do you deal with people who don't understand?" "My family keeps telling me to get over it, like PTSD is a bad mood." Sarah nodded, recognizing the frustration in his voice. You can't make them understand experiences they've never had, but you can help them understand that understanding isn't required for support. They don't need to comprehend what you've been through. They just need to accept that it changed you and respect the person you've become. It was the same message she had tried to convey to her own family with mixed results. Her parents still hoped she would eventually return to her original plans, still saw her current work as a temporary detour rather than a deliberate choice. But they had stopped pushing quite as hard, especially after seeing the positive response from the students she worked with. After class, Sarah drove to Lincoln High for the monthly veterans discussion group she had started in partnership with Mrs. Patterson. The English teacher had been instrumental in creating a forum for students to engage with difficult questions about service, sacrifice, and moral complexity in an age of interstellar conflict. Today's topic was particularly relevant. The recent terrorist attack on the Martian trade station carried out by Zephyrian separatists who rejected the peace treaty. 3 human civilians had died, and the incident had reignited debates about whether the war had truly ended or simply paused. "Why are we even talking to them?" demanded Tyler Morrison, a senior whose older brother had died in the siege of Kepler Station. "They're aliens. They attacked us. We should have wiped them out when we had the chance." Sarah let the comment hang in the air for a moment, watching the other students process the raw anger in Tyler's voice. She had learned that the most valuable teaching moments came from authentic emotion rather than theoretical discussion. "That's one perspective," she said finally. "Tyler, what would that solution have looked like in practical terms?" "Total war," Tyler replied without hesitation. "No negotiation, no compromise. Humanity first." "Okay, let's think through that scenario." Sarah moved to the whiteboard, drawing a rough map of the colonial territories. "Total war against the Zephyrians means conflict in 17 star systems, including 8 with human civilian populations. It means dedicating our entire industrial capacity to military production for at least another decade." She marked the locations of major human colonies with red dots. "It means accepting casualties in the millions, possibly tens of millions. It means transforming our entire civilization into a military machine with no guarantee of victory." The room was quiet now, students beginning to grasp the scope of Tyler's proposed solution. "And if we won," Sarah continued, "it means taking responsibility for governing survivors of a species we've tried to exterminate. It means becoming the kind of civilization that solves problems through genocide." Tyler shifted uncomfortably. "But they started it." "They did, and we finished it, through military victory that forced them to negotiate. The question is whether finishing it through extermination would have made us safer or just different." A sophomore named Ashley raised her hand. "What about the families of people who died in the attacks? Don't they deserve justice?" It was a fair question, one that Sarah had wrestled with personally. She had lost friends to Zephyrian weapons, people whose deaths felt like open wounds that would never properly heal. "Justice is complicated when you're dealing with an entire species," she said. "Individual Zephyrians committed war crimes, and many of them have faced consequences through their own legal system. But collective punishment, making every member of their species pay for the actions of some, that's not justice. That's revenge." "What's the difference?" Tyler asked. Sarah paused, thinking about how to explain a distinction that had taken her years to understand. "Justice seeks to restore balance and prevent future harm. Revenge seeks to inflict equivalent suffering. Sometimes they overlap, but they're not the same thing." The discussion continued for another hour, covering topics that would have been unthinkable in a high school classroom before the war. These students had grown up during humanity's first interstellar conflict, and they were grappling with questions about species survival, moral responsibility, and the price of peace that previous generations had never faced. After the session ended, Sarah found herself in conversation with Dr. Williams, who had initially been skeptical of the veterans' discussion group, but had become one of its strongest supporters. "I owe you an apology," he said as students filed out of the classroom. "When you spoke here 6 months ago, I thought you had gone off script. I was worried about complaints from parents and district officials." "You got plenty of those," Sarah reminded him. "Yes, but I also got something else. Students who ask harder questions, think more carefully about complex issues, and approach service with realistic expectations rather than romantic fantasies. College admissions counselors tell me our students' application essays have become remarkably sophisticated when discussing ethics and civic responsibility." Sarah smiled, remembering her own naive application essays about wanting to discover alien life and contribute to scientific knowledge. "They're growing up in a more complicated world than we did. They need better tools for thinking about complexity." The drive home took her through the older part of Sacramento, past the memorial park that had been dedicated to local veterans of the Zephyrian War. 43 names were carved into the black granite wall, representing just the soldiers from their immediate area who had died in service. Sarah knew most of the names personally, had served with them, eaten meals with them, watched some of them die. She parked and walked to the memorial, something she did at least once a week, not from obligation or guilt, but from the need to remember that the cost of peace had been paid in specific human lives rather than abstract statistics. Private Martinez's name was third from the top, exactly where it should be alphabetically. Sarah touched the carved letters with her fingertip, a ritual that helped keep his memory clear and specific rather than allowing it to fade into general grief. "Hey, Martinez," she said quietly. "I talked to some kids today about moral complexity and the price of justice. I think you would have liked the discussion. They asked hard questions." A family approached the memorial, an older couple and a young woman about Sarah's age. They moved with the careful dignity of people visiting a grave, stopping in front of a name toward the bottom of the wall. The young woman placed a small American flag next to the stone and whispered something Sarah couldn't hear. Sarah maintained her distance, respecting their private moment, but the woman noticed her and walked over. "Are you Lieutenant Chen?" she asked. "From the school assembly last spring?" Sarah nodded, trying to place the woman's face among the hundreds of students she had addressed. "I'm Rebecca Torres. My brother David is on this wall." She gestured toward the memorial. "He used to talk about you and your unit, about how you looked out for the younger soldiers." David Torres. Sarah remembered him clearly, 19 years old, from a large family in East Sacramento, always volunteering for extra duty to send more money home. He had died during the evacuation of Titan's Reach, buying time for civilian transports to escape the orbital bombardment. "David was a good soldier," Sarah said simply. "He saved lives." "I wanted to thank you," Rebecca continued, "not just for bringing him home, but for what you said at the assembly, about how they weren't heroes, just people making impossible choices. It helped me understand what David was going through, why he changed during his service." Sarah felt the familiar weight of survivor's guilt, the knowledge that random chance and tactical positioning had determined who came home and who remained in alien soil. But she also felt something else, gratitude for the opportunity to help people understand the human cost of interstellar conflict. "He would be proud of the peace we're building," Sarah said. "Not perfect, not simple, but real." After the family left, Sarah remained at the memorial for another few minutes, thinking about the various ways people processed loss and meaning. Some, like Tyler Morrison, turned grief into anger and called for simple solutions to complex problems. Others, like Rebecca Torres, sought understanding and found ways to honor sacrifice without demanding revenge. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Johnson, now completing his first year of intelligence training. "Learning about Zephyrian cultural patterns today. Fascinating how their concept of honor differs from ours. Understanding the enemy makes victory more meaningful, not less. Sarah smiled, remembering her own early assumptions about alien motivations and behavior. The war had taught humanity that intelligence and moral capacity weren't uniquely human traits, that other species faced the same fundamental challenges of survival, cooperation, and ethical choice that defined human civilization. The next morning brought a new challenge. Dr. Vasquez had referred a recent veteran to Sarah's transition program, a young woman named Captain Lisa Wong, who had commanded a forward reconnaissance unit during the final phase of the war. According to the file, Captain Wong was struggling with what the military called moral injury, the psychological damage that resulted from being forced to take actions that violated personal ethical standards, even when those actions were necessary and legally justified. Sarah met with Captain Wong in her office at the community college, recognizing immediately the controlled tension of someone holding themselves together through sheer force of will. Wong was 24, but carried herself with the careful precision of someone much older, every movement calculated to avoid revealing vulnerability. "I don't need therapy," Wong said, before Sarah could begin her standard intake interview. "I need to know how to live with decisions I can't undo and consequences I can't escape." It was a distinction Sarah understood intimately. Traditional therapy focused on healing, but some experiences changed people in ways that couldn't be healed, only integrated into a new version of themselves. "Tell me about the decisions," Sarah said simply. Captain Wong stared out the window for a long moment before speaking. "Final assault on the Zephyrian Command Center. We had intelligence that they were planning a biological weapons attack on civilian populations. My unit was tasked with infiltrating their facility and preventing the launch." Sarah waited, recognizing the careful cadence of someone who had told this story in official debriefings, but never in personal terms. "We found the weapons," Wong continued. "But we also found their research team. 6 Zephyrian scientists, non-combatants according to the Geneva Conventions and the interspecies warfare protocols. They were trying to destroy their research when we arrived." The story unfolded slowly, each detail carved from reluctance and professional necessity. Wong's unit had discovered that the Zephyrian scientists weren't developing weapons, but attempting to create a vaccine against human biological weapons they believed were being deployed against their own civilian populations. The intelligence had been wrong. Not deliberately falsified, but based on incomplete information and cultural misunderstanding. "I had to choose," Wong said finally. "Follow orders based on potentially false intelligence or make a battlefield decision that could compromise the entire mission. I chose the mission." Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of that choice. Military operations depended on trust in the chain of command and the accuracy of intelligence reports. But ground-level commanders sometimes faced situations where following orders conflicted with emerging information. What happened to the scientists? They became prisoners of war. Technically, I made the right choice according to military law and ethical guidelines. But I ended up detaining people who were trying to save lives rather than take them. It was the kind of moral complexity that civilian populations preferred not to contemplate, the gray areas where good intentions and imperfect information led to actions that couldn't be easily categorized as right or wrong. Sarah spent the next hour helping Captain Wong work through the psychological framework for processing moral injury, not healing because some experiences couldn't be healed, but integration. Learning to carry the weight of imperfect choices without being crushed by it. "The goal isn't to feel better about what you did," Sarah explained. "The goal is to understand that moral injury is the price of moral responsibility. People who never face complex choices don't develop moral injury, but they also don't develop moral depth." After the session, Sarah drove back toward her apartment, thinking about the various ways war damaged people and the different approaches to rebuilding meaningful lives from the fragments. Her phone rang as she pulled into her parking space. Her mother, calling with the weekly update on family news and gentle suggestions about her future plans. Dr. Martinez from UC Davis called, her mother said without preamble. He has a research position opening up. Something about interspecies biology and cultural adaptation. He thinks your military experience would be valuable perspective. Sarah considered the offer as she climbed the stairs to her apartment. Academic research would be respectable work, the kind of career her parents had always envisioned for her. It would also be safe, insulated from the messy realities of helping traumatized veterans rebuild their lives. "I'll think about it," she said, though she already knew her answer. That evening, Sarah sat on her small balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that reminded her of plasma fire over alien landscapes. Her laptop was open to a half-finished article about moral complexity in military education, part of a series she was writing for a veterans publication. Her phone buzzed with a message from Jennifer Walsh. "Heading into my sophomore year with a double major in xenobiology and diplomatic studies. Planning to focus my senior thesis on interspecies conflict resolution. Would love to interview you about practical applications of ethical theory in combat situations." Another message arrived from Ashley, the sophomore from the Veterans Discussion Group. "Starting to think about college applications, interested in studying how societies recover from trauma. Any suggestions for programs that combine psychology with conflict studies?" Sarah smiled, recognizing the ripple effects of honest conversation spreading beyond her immediate circle of influence. The students she had taught were becoming teachers themselves, carrying forward more sophisticated approaches to thinking about service, sacrifice, and moral responsibility. She turned back to her laptop and continued writing. "The challenge facing returning veterans isn't learning to live normal lives again. Normal implies a return to a previous state, which is neither possible nor desirable after transformative experiences. Instead, the challenge is learning to live meaningful lives as the people we have become." The article continued, exploring the differences between healing and integration, between seeking comfort and seeking purpose. Sarah wrote about the students who contacted her months after her presentation at Lincoln High, how their thoughtful questions demonstrated that young people were capable of handling complex truths when presented with respect rather than condescension. As she wrote, Sarah realized that she had found her answer to Dr. Vasquez's question about identity and purpose. She wasn't the person who had left for war 3 years ago, and she wasn't trying to become that person again. She was someone new, shaped by loss and trauma, but also by the knowledge that difficult truths could create positive change when shared with courage and honesty. The war was over, but the work of building peace continued. Not the simple peace of ending conflict, but the complex peace of creating societies capable of handling moral ambiguity, cultural difference, and the ongoing challenge of interspecies cooperation. Sarah closed her laptop and went inside, thinking about tomorrow's lesson plan for her transition course. She would talk about purpose and identity, about finding meaning in the gap between who you used to be and who you had become. She would tell them about the students who reached out with thoughtful questions, about the ripple effects of choosing truth over comfort. Most importantly, she would help them understand that coming home wasn't the end of their story. It was the beginning of a different kind of service, one that might be less dramatic, but no less important than anything they had done in uniform. The school assembly had been 6 months ago, but its consequences were still spreading. Students were asking harder questions, making more thoughtful choices, and approaching the challenges of interstellar citizenship with realistic expectations rather than romantic illusions. It wasn't the homecoming anyone had planned for, but it was honest in a way that mattered more than comfort. And in a galaxy where humans were learning to coexist with alien civilizations, honesty about complexity and moral ambiguity might be the most valuable gift one generation could give to the next.